Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Well, the country has seen a lot of controversy recently. Of course, a lot of attention has been focused on these recent riots that have taken place in Minneapolis and the two people that were killed by ICE agents, and this has stirred up a great deal of controversy. And it could be argued that even more recently than that, it turns out that there was a man named Elliot Forhan, who's the Democratic candidate for Ohio Attorney General. And this past Tuesday, he announced a plan to have Donald Trump executed following a hypothetical trial and guilty verdict. Apparently, he wants to bring charges if he gets elected to the Attorney General. He wants to bring charges against Trump and have him convicted on capital crimes and have him executed. And and then, of course, could be argued that these are just symptoms of a much larger and broader problem that's afflicting American society as a whole. We think back to our example of the Capitol Hill riots that took place back in January of 2021, and uh, the fact that there were leading the vice president of the United States had to practically flee for his own life, that kind of thing, and it really raises some questions. We see the hostility and the divisions that's going on in American society today. The question is, can the American Republic survive the growing distrust, hostility, and violence that's going on today? Now, to understand the background of this, the significance of this, you have to go back to the background. The principles on which the Republic was founded are contained in the Declaration of Independence. It begins by appealing to the laws of nature and of nature's God. And then it makes this famous statement: We hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, basically, I think as we pointed out before in previous videos, Thomas Jefferson who wrote that, was not an Orthodox Bible believing Christian, but he did take for granted the existence of a supreme being and the idea that there's some kind of a moral order to the universe. And he appeals to the concept of the laws of nature in particular, which goes back to ancient Greek times with the Stoics. And the idea that there is a moral law out there to which we're all accountable. And so then he said that we're endowed by he says all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, the problem with modern secularism is that statement is patently false. There is no Creator who endows us with anything. But then that raises some very, very serious questions. What makes us equal? Some people are rich, some people are poor, some people are physically strong, some people are physically disabled. Some people have PhDs, some people are mentally retarded. How are we equal? According to modern secularism, because we all evolve, we're in the process of evolving from lower forms of life, there's no human essence that really defines us as human beings. And then you get the question, well, where do human rights come from? If there is no Creator who endowed us with certain unalienable rights, where do these rights come from? And what makes them unalienable? Okay, the Supreme Court giveth and the Supreme Court taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Supreme Court. And so what happens in modern secularism is that we wind up leading a meaningless, purposeless existence in an amoral universe. And what happens then as human beings, we try to fill the void with something less than God. So on the one hand, on the left, there's a tendency to result to the idea of a class struggle, that this one group is oppressing another group, and we have to stand up for the oppressed group. The problem with that for society as a whole is it basically divides society up into good guys and bad guys, the oppressed and the oppressors. And in this case, the bad guys are white males of European descent. And then on the right, this provokes a reaction on the right, where you get kind of like an extreme form of nationalism, where people find their identity in basically their race or ethnicity. And you have some extreme examples with the alt-right and the neo-Nazis. So basically what we're going to try to argue here is that secularism leads to the breakdown of public morality, which in turn leads to social chaos. This in turn is going to result in an authoritarian government, and the whole thing is a judgment from God. And I think one passage of scripture that really kind of lays this out, I think, pretty clearly, is in Romans chapter 1. We've been going through the second half of Romans chapter 1. And today we come to verses 28 through 32, which says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedience to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." And that comes from the New King James Version. Well, and it really does give a vivid picture of a civilization in an advanced state of decline, and kind of a picture of what's actually going on in our society today. So first of all, he talks about what he calls a depraved man. He says, "Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do the things which are not fitting." So when he talks about a debased mind, he's basically saying that there's a certain, he says it's a mentality that kind of fails the test. It does things that are futile and self-destructive, that doesn't really accomplish anything positive or constructive. And it says to do the things which are not fitting. And this in turn implies a kind of a moral order. There's a certain way things are supposed to fit. Okay, they're supposed to function together. And when people, cast aside, moral absolutes and so on and eternal truths, then they wind up doing things that are leads to dysfunction. And then he goes on in verse 29, the first part. He lays out some of the general principles. He says, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, and so on. And these are kind of like some of the basic moral principles that have wound up creeping into society. When it talks about unrighteousness, this would reflect the way we treat each other, that we treat each other unfairly or unjustly, that in some ways we deprive them of some of their rights and maybe steal from them. When he talks about covetousness, of course, he's talking about selfish greed. And a good example of this I like to use, of course, is the idea of the corner convenience store. Okay, you walk in there and they sell tobacco products. Do the owners of the store honestly believe that tobacco products are good for you? And almost always they would say no. Then why are you selling them? Because if you can get people addicted to something that you're selling and you can make a profit off of it, then that increases your bottom line. Or another thing that you get is that in so many cases you've got states that are trying to support themselves financially through lotteries, state-run lotteries. Ask any financial advisor, and would he tell you that buying a lottery tickets is a good financial investment? No. And what it is that we're taking money out of the poor, preying on their desperation, waving a $1 million bill in front of them, and then we wind up just taking their money from them. And that's just plain dishonest. And that's typical of the way that human beings take advantage of each other. And it could be argued that it's rooted in human nature, but when you have a breakdown in public morality, it winds up becoming rampant in society. And then he goes on in the second half of verse 29 and verse 30 to talk about specific sins. He says they're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedience to parents. And basically the covetousness, of course, is the unrighteousness, again, goes about the way we mistreat others. When it talks about covetousness, we're talking about the selfish greed, which defines most people today. They're just very self-oriented, looking out for their own selves and doing whatever they can get away with to advance themselves. And then when it talks about maliciousness, he's talking about being mean and nasty to others, which is kind of typical of the way people treat each other. And so these are the underlying motives that largely drive human behavior in a degenerate society. And people are just very, very self-oriented and motivated by a desire to promote their own selfish interests, and they wind up taking advantage of each other, and that's what it is. And then he goes on and he talks about certain other sins. He talks about the religious attitude, that they're haters of God, and then the underlying attitudes: they're proud, they're boastful, they're moted. Um, they're proud, they're boasters, and basically what it is that even when they're outwardly trying to do something good and positive and constructive, it's basically just to put themselves on a platform and advance their own prestige and status. And then you come down to verse 31, and it's kind of fascinating here. He says that they're undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. All those words beginning with the prefix un. And the implication there is there's a complete lack of positive virtue. He says that we're untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. And the idea is that we're supposed to be kind and compassionate toward one another and be able to sympathize with one another in their distress. But we're totally lacking in that kind of thing. We become so self-oriented that we lack those positive virtues. And then Paul points out that ultimately all of this is ultimately a judgment from God himself. So, for example, in verse 28, it says, he starts off the passage by saying, and even as they did not like to retain God and their knowledge, God gave them over. And the implication there is that these human desires, these sinful human desires, self-centered desires, have always existed in us as human beings. It's a part of human nature. But God was exercising a restraining influence, and so then, when society becomes secularized and refuses to acknowledge God as the Creator and Lord, God removes His restraining hand and lets us act out our own natural desires and interests, and the result is social chaos. And then he says and I have things pointed out, sometimes there's this theological debate or philosophical debate about, the relationship between the sovereignty of God and human responsibility and so on. And the Bible makes it very, very clear that God is not the author of sin. Even though all of this takes place because of something that God decided to do, namely remove his restraining hand, that does not make God the author of the sin. He's basically letting us do what we want to do, and we're acting according to our own natural desires and lusts. Then he goes down in verse 28, and the reason why, of course, is because of our refusal to acknowledge God. God is our creator. He put us here on this planet. Everything that we have ultimately came from him. And yet modern society stubbornly refuses to acknowledge him and worship him as the true God and creator. And so that's why he says in verse 28, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind. Then you go down to verse 32. And it says, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So in other words, there's a certain sense in which God has created us with a certain kind of moral sense. We do have consciences, and yet we wind up doing things that we ourselves know are wrong and worthy of condemnation. And then we wind up not only that, but in a corrupt society, we wind up changing the public morality, the public morals of society, and we wind up condoning some of these practices in actual practice. And so you get this breakdown of public morality. So what we are witnessing today is nothing less than the collapse of an entire civilization. To me, this is kind of painful because I was a history major in college. I took 3 semesters of Western Civ, and I'm conscious of the fact that what we're seeing today is the collapse of a civilization that went back for 2,000 years or so. It could trace its roots back to ancient Jerusalem and Athens, and it was a society that was based on. It could be argued that, strictly speaking, it wasn't strictly a Christian society, but it did kind of pay lip service to Christianity, and at least acknowledge the existence of a supreme being and the acknowledgement of a moral order to the universe, a moral code to which we must all conform. And what we're seeing today is the collapse of that moral structure in society, and that in turn makes a democracy impossible to function. In order for a free society to function, the common ordinary people have to have a sense of moral obligation so that they will obey the laws because it's the right thing to do and it's in the best interest of society as a whole. So we talk about the idea of the rule of law. Lex Rex, the law is king. And that means that everyone, including those in power, have an obligation to obey a commonly held set of rules. So, in other words, just because you happen to be at the top of the power chain doesn't give you the right to just do whatever you want to do, but rather you're a part of society as a whole, and you have to act in the best interest of society as a whole as well. And it should result in a willingness to make personal sacrifices for the common good. And I think a really tragic example of this is the way that people reacted to the COVID pandemic, where you even had people, you know, that thought of themselves as social conservatives would go around saying, my body, my choice, and, I'm not going to get wear a face mask or get vaccinated. And they completely so overlook the fact, sidestep the fact that we're talking about a deadly disease, spreads very rapidly through a virus, and that it's potentially kills people. You're putting people's lives at death, and you have a responsibility to other people to cooperate with the public health authorities to try to contain the disease and save people's lives. Okay, life is precious, and secularism destroys all of that. We simply exist as autonomous beings and are free to pursue our own individual self-interest. And as a result, in a secular society, democracy simply cannot function. What you wind up with is just pure anarchy, and then this in turn will typically result in the loss and the rise of an authoritarian government to bring order out of the chaos. And so I think that's where we're probably headed. And then, of course, if you look at it in terms of biblical prophecy, you can't help but wonder if whether or not we're actually headed to the Great Tribulation. What really concerns me is that, with the secularization of society, you've got a younger generation that's rising up. They're growing up in these dysfunctional single-parent families, have no idea, how you'd ever make a marriage work because they've never seen it happen before. A lot of times they're bearing emotional scars themselves. They have very little familiarity with the Bible and its teachings. And so then when they are old enough to take charge, what is the world going to look like then? And so it's, you can't help but wonder if maybe this is, we're approaching the Great Tribulation that is predicted in Scripture. And so then as Christians, the question is, are we prepared to suffer persecution? And you might want to read a book, and I don't have a copy of it right handed with me, a book that I published a while back, and it's available on Amazon, entitled The Church in the World, What It Means to Follow Christ in a Post-Christian World. And I think that's basically what we're into right now. We're in a largely post-Christian world. And sometimes I think modern evangelical Christians forget that the New Testament was written to Christians who suffered persecution in a non-Christian world. And there's a lot of passages in there about remaining faithful to Christ, persevering to the end as we suffer for Christ, and that we have to live lives of nonconformity to the surrounding world. And so I hope that we'll all take that seriously. And the question is, what kind of a relationship do we actually have with Christ? And are we really determined to follow him in all that he says? Well, I hope you take all that to heart, and thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again. Bye now.